Pam Bondi tried to humiliate Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett on live TV by mocking her childhood, but she didn't expect a retired teacher to call and expose the real story and leave the room speechless. The show was called Morning Circle, a sleek, polished national broadcast out of Los Angeles with a reputation for friendly jabs and political fireworks. On this particular Thursday, the energy in the studio was already running high. The panel was stacked former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi, Congressman Eli Becker from Pennsylvania, political strategist Teresa Lynn, and sitting U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas. Everyone expected sparks, but no one saw that moment coming. The discussion had shifted to education reform, teacher shortages crumbling, schools' test scores when Bondi leaned in, that practiced grin on her face. "Well, look," she said, gesturing with both hands. "I mean, Jasmine here is talking about education policy. This is the same person who allegedly failed second grade. So forgive me if I don't take her very seriously on school issues." The words landed like a slap. A few in the audience laughed, not a lot, not full-throated, more of a nervous murmur. Even the host, Craig Harmon, looked off camera, uncertain. Teresa Lynn blinked hard and scribbled something on her notepad. Congressman Becker adjusted his tie and took a long drink of water. Jasmine's eyes didn't flinch, but her shoulders stiffened. She sat upright, blinking slowly, pressing her lips together like she was holding something back. The camera zoomed in, catching every shift of her expression. "You done?" she asked calmly. Bondi gave a shrug, just stating the facts or rumors. But hey, if we're talking about academic excellence, maybe we should start with people who didn't struggle with basic grammar at age 7. The shot panned to Jasmine again. You could feel it. The tension crawling across the room. She breathed in through her nose, trying to pull herself out of the quicksand. That this moment threatened to become the kind where you either get angry and lose, or stay composed and still lose. Craig tried to save it. "Let's pivot just slightly here." "No, Jasmine," said her voice low and firm. "Let's not pivot." The room went still again. You could hear someone cough. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't blink much, just stared at Bondi like she was staring through her. "I didn't fail second grade," she said slowly. "My mother had to move us mid-year. I repeated a few months in a new school to catch up on different curriculum. That's not failure, that's survival." Bondi opened her mouth again, probably ready to joke it off or pivot to something more comfortable. But Jasmine leaned forward. "You think making fun of how a kid learns makes you clever?" she asked, her voice still quiet. "It doesn't. It makes you mean." Bondi scoffed, but the smugness on her face had dulled. It was like she hadn't expected Jasmine to push back, at least not like that. Craig cleared his throat and gave the producers a subtle glance. The tension was spiraling out of control. This wasn't just TV drama, it was raw. "Okay," he said, trying again. "We're going to take a quick commercial break and return with more on today's education discussion." The cameras pulled back, the bright studio lights dimmed slightly as they cut to commercial backstage. The control room buzzed with quiet chaos. Producers were whispering. Others were typing furiously. One assistant was already clipping the segment to post it online, but then a call came through on the private line. "I need to speak to someone in charge," said an older woman's voice on the other end. "My name is Eileen Porter. I was Jasmine Crocker's second grade tutor, and I think your audience deserves to hear the truth." But nobody in that control room had any idea just how much that one voice was about to change everything. In the dim, windowless control room above Studio 4B4 monitors flickered with live footage from the set. The panelists were on a break, sipping water and touching up makeup. But up here, no one was breathing easy. "Did she really say that on air?" asked Tony, the show's segment producer, wide-eyed as she replayed the last few seconds of the clip. "She did," replied Leon, the senior producer, arms crossed, staring at the screen like it had just insulted his mother. "She absolutely did. It's already trending," chimed in a younger tech named Maya, eyes darting between Twitter feeds and a Slack thread lighting up with exclamation marks, clips going viral. Hashtags already started second grade. Leon muttered something under his breath and turned toward the phone line flashing in the corner. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. "It's a viewer call," said Tony, line 3, probably someone mad. Leon hesitated for half a second. Normally they didn't touch calls mid-broadcast. Everything was pre-screened, but today already felt off-script. He picked up the line. "This is production," he said briskly. "Hello, my name is Eileen Porter," said the voice on the other end. "I used to tutor Jasmine Crockett when she was a little girl. I heard what that woman just said. I think you ought to hear the real story." Leon blinked. "You said you were her tutor." "Yes," said the voice. Her tone wasn't angry. It was calm, firm, and carried the weight of someone used to being ignored but not mistaken. Tony glanced over. "Put her through." Leon covered the mouthpiece. "What do you think?" Tony paused. "Live? I mean, we don't have time to vet her story in full," he whispered. "But we've already taken a hit with Bondi's comments. The internet's gonna fry us if we just let it slide." She sounded credible. Tony asked Leon. Nodded slowly. She sounded like a teacher who's had enough. They were silent for a moment. "Let's do it," Tony said. "Have Craig set it up. Don't give Bondi a heads up. Let it play." Leon pressed a button on the console. "Ma'am, we're going to bring you in right after the break. Keep your answers clean and truthful. No politics, no profanity, got it?" "Yes, sir," Miss Porter said, steady as ever. "I just want to tell folks what really happened." By the time the break ended, the crew was back in place. Craig shuffled his cue cards, nervously adjusting his mic. Bondi sat stiffly fiddling with her pen. Jasmine hadn't said much during the pause. She leaned back in her chair, unreadable. The red light came on. Craig smiled, but his voice was thinner than before. "We're back," he said, "and during the break we received a call from a viewer who says she has a personal connection to Representative Crockett's school years. We've decided to take that call." Live joining us now is Miss Eileen Porter from Dallas, Texas. Pam Bondi's eyes narrowed. Jasmine turned confused for a half-second, but then she stilled. The studio's audio line opened, and Miss Porter's voice came through, crackling slightly, but clear. "Good morning," she said. "This is Eileen Porter, and I was Jasmine Crockett's second-grade tutor. I'd like to speak on her behalf because I know exactly what happened in that classroom." Craig glanced at Bondi, then at Jasmine, then leaned forward. "Go ahead, Miss Porter. The floor is yours." Miss Porter took a breath. Jasmine didn't fail second grade. Her mother had to move her during the year from one side of Garland to another. She transferred into my classroom 2 months before the end of the term. There was a brief silence. Everyone was listening now that school Ridgeview Elementary was underfunded. The books were 5 years out of date. We had 29 students and 2 working heaters in January. Jasmine came in behind, sure, but it wasn't because she was slow or lazy. It was because her last school hadn't taught her the same curriculum. Pam shifted in her seat. "I started tutoring her aft. That's all I came to say," and with that, the line dropped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy because the damage had already been done. But so had something else. They cut to commercial. But the silence in the studio didn't move. No one talked. No one even looked at Pam. Bondi Jasmine stared ahead, not at the cameras, not at Craig, not at the blinking studio lights, just into the still air. Her jaw set and unmoving. Backstage, a production assistant fumbled her clipboard. No one noticed on the screen above the crew pit. The commercial break rolled on a chipper segment about weekend sales at a major department store. But nobody was watching. Tony leaned into Leon's ear. She just changed the entire temperature of the room. Leon didn't answer. He was already watching Jasmine, knowing full well this wasn't just a PR moment anymore. It was something else, something older. Craig came back from break a little slower than usual. "We're live again," he said, his voice more grounded than it had been all morning. "Before we move on, I just want to acknowledge Miss Porter's call that was unexpected and powerful." He looked at Jasmine, giving her space to speak. She didn't take it at first. She blinked, then exhaled through her nose, then finally turned her head and looked directly into the camera. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wasn't planning to talk about this today. I thought we were here to debate education policy, not defend my childhood." Bondi shifted in her seat. Jasmine didn't look at her. "I was 7 years old," she continued, "and I was trying to figure out why we had to keep moving apartments every 6 months. I didn't know the word eviction back then, but I knew how it felt to pack at night and sleep in the car with my mom at the Quick Trip parking lot on Forest Lane." She paused just long enough to let the weight of the words settle. "I wasn't a failing student. I was a tired one. I was a hungry one. I was a little girl trying not to make noise while my mom cried in the next room because she couldn't pay the rent. Craig kept quiet. Teresa Lynn had both hands folded tightly in her lap. Unmoving, Jasmine sat up straighter when we got to Ridgeview Elementary. The cafeteria worker whispered to Miss Porter that I didn't eat lunch the day before she started keeping food for me in her drawer. That's how I knew I mattered to someone. That's how I knew I could try. She paused again, letting that memory settle in her throat. Miss Porter gave me a clipboard so I wouldn't have to write on my lap. She sat next to me after school, even when I smelled like cigarettes and Febreze from my mom's cleaning jobs. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Now she did turn to Bondi. You tried to humiliate me on national TV using a story you don't even understand, but you didn't embarrass me. You reminded me who I am and where I come from. Pam didn't respond. Her expression was blank, but the live feed was catching it all. I was never embarrassed by my education. Jasmine said only by the people who made assumptions about it. The room stayed quiet, a different kind of silence this time. Not the awkward kind, the kind that stays still out of respect. Craig finally broke it, but carefully. I think we'll move to our next segment shortly, but Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for sharing that. Jasmine nodded this time softly. That's not something I hide, but it's not something I thought I'd have to defend in front of millions of strangers. She looked back at the camera again. Some kids don't have perfect grades. Some have tougher roads than others. That doesn't make them less smart. It just means they had more to carry on the way to class. But what nobody realized yet was that this wasn't the peak of the moment. It was just the start of what would soon spread far beyond that studio. When Jasmine left the studio that day, she didn't say much to anyone. She thanked the crew. She shook Craig's hand, then she walked out of the building into the parking lot behind the soundstage in Burbank and sat in her rental car for almost 10 minutes before turning the engine on her phone buzzed nonstop texts, missed calls, social media tags climbing by the hundreds. But she ignored all of it. For now, she needed to sit with the memory Miss Porter had pulled back from the past like a box she thought she'd buried back in Texas in a small 2-bedroom apartment near Garland Road. Miss Eileen Porter sat on the edge of her bed, hands folded in her lap. She hadn't expected the call to go viral. She didn't even own a Twitter account, but her niece had already texted her 3 times in all caps. You broke the internet. She didn't care about the noise. She cared about Jasmine and what people still didn't know. She turned off the TV and opened a small wooden drawer from her nightstand. Inside were a few faded photos. One of a class trip to the Arboretum, another of her old Ridgeview classroom with a Christmas bulletin board that said, "Believe in yourself," and then a photo of Jasmine, 7 years old, too small for her cardigan, front tooth missing eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. Eileen remembered the Thursday afternoon that Jasmine finally spelled responsibility correctly. After weeks of trying, she had jumped from her seat and said, "You can tell my mom." Right, you can tell her I got it. She had called her mother that evening, just like she promised. But there were also harder memories, like the day Jasmine showed up with a trash bag holding all her clothes. Miss Porter found her in the front office with red-rimmed eyes saying they had to leave their last place and hadn't found a new one yet. The principal let her nap on the nurse's cot while her mother worked a late shift cleaning hospitals. That was the day Miss Porter started keeping a blanket in her drawer. She didn't do it for thanks. She did it because someone had to. One particular night stood out. Miss Porter had stayed late grading papers when she noticed Jasmine sitting on the curb outside the building. She wasn't reading. She wasn't playing. She was just still when Miss Porter came out. Jasmine looked up and said, "I think I'm just always going to be the one behind." That sentence had nearly broken her. She sat down beside her on the curb. "You're not behind," she told her. "You're just climbing a harder hill. Doesn't mean you won't reach the top." And Jasmine had looked at her like she wasn't sure whether to believe it. But she nodded, and the next day she came in early to try again. Now, decades later, Miss Porter had just told part of that story on live television. And even though her hands were still shaking a little, she didn't regret it for a second. Meanwhile, the internet caught fire clips from the show popped up across social platforms. Some showed Pam Bondi's face tightening mid-insult. Others played Miss Porter's words on a loop, "You mock her now." But I watched her earn every step. Some people tried to spin it. Bondi was joking. One tweet read, "It's politics, get over it." But most of the responses looked different. She spoke for every kid who struggled but kept going. This hit me in the gut. I had a teacher like Miss Porter once saved my life. My kid's in second grade right now thinks he's stupid because he reads slower than his classmates. This gave me a whole new way to talk to him. Bondi's team released a brief statement by midday. It didn't say much, just that her comments had been taken out of context and that she respects all Americans, regardless of their academic past. It landed like a wet paper towel on a tile floor. Because what Miss Porter said wasn't a soundbite. It was a wound people recognized. But what truly changed everything was what Jasmine posted just a few hours later. A message that came not from a congresswoman but from a former second grader. Jasmine's post went live. Just after 6 p.m. Central, a black screen white text, no dramatic music, no talking head. Just this: when I was 7, my teacher kept a blanket in her desk drawer because she knew I might not have a place to sleep when I was 8. I learned to write my first essay sitting on a laundromat bench while my mom folded strangers' clothes for cash. When I was 9, I won a reading ribbon at school. I walked home with it pinned to my shirt like it was armor. And now I'm here. If you think a child's struggle is something to laugh at, you were never that child. Thank you, Miss Porter. You saw me when the world didn't. Within an hour, the post had been shared 40,000 times by midnight. It had crossed 2 million views and was featured on the homepages of major news outlets. Screenshots of Jasmine's words were posted alongside photos of crowded public school classrooms, worn-out textbooks, and kids eating lunch alone in gymnasiums. But the real shift didn't come from celebrities or political commentators. It came from teachers, elementary school. Teachers from Missouri to New Mexico started sharing their own stories. Teachers who had once brought extra food in Ziploc bags for a student who always forgot their lunch. Teachers who used their own paychecks to buy winter coats. Teachers who never got thanked until now. One post from a retired teacher in Ohio read, "They laughed at a little girl's story today, but the rest of us recognized it." Even high school students chimed in. "My math teacher used to leave the class to cry in the hallway. I thought she was weak. Now I know she was carrying all of us. I never told my third grade teacher. Thank you, she kept a journal of my progress. Even when I didn't, the tone of the conversation had changed. It wasn't just about Jasmine, it was about what she represented. A kind of silent resilience. Too many people in power pretend not to see that night. The Morning Circle clip reached the phones of people who didn't normally follow politics. Moms waiting in the car line, janitors on break, bus drivers sitting in their empty seats after drop-off, and they didn't see a politician, they saw a kid. They used to be, meanwhile, inside a conference room in Tallahassee. Pam Bondi's team huddled around a laptop watching the media cyclone swirl louder and louder. "She's running the narrative now," her communications director muttered. "We need to push back," someone else said. "Release an edited version of the panel. Say it was sarcasm taken out of context," but Bondi stayed quiet. Her phone buzzed nonstop, her inbox filled with emails. Some supportive, most not one particularly scathing. Subject line simply read, "Shame isn't a good color on you." She turned to the window, then back to the table. "Let it cool off," she said, "it'll pass." But she didn't sound convinced because for the first time in her career, she wasn't the one controlling the heat. By the next morning, news anchors weren't discussing education policy. They were discussing Miss Porter. Morning shows across the country replayed her audio sentence by sentence, like it was gospel. She stayed an extra hour every day. She asked, "Do smart kids cry too?" She wasn't failing, she was surviving. The clips didn't need commentary. They were commentary in a downtown Dallas coffee shop. Miss Porter sat quietly at a corner table, nursing a lukewarm tea, her phone face down on the table. She wasn't on Twitter. She didn't need to be. She had told the truth, and truth once spoken doesn't go away. The manager brought over another tea on the house. "Miss Porter," she said with a small smile. "That thing you said on TV, my mom cried when she heard it, said it sounded like her story." Miss Porter smiled gently. "We all carry pieces of the same one," she said. But the most important voice still hadn't been heard, not from a statement or a post, but from Jasmine herself, sitting down in person to explain why that moment hurt and why it mattered. By Saturday morning, Jasmine was sitting across from veteran journalist Carla Reyes in a quiet studio in Arlington. No audience, no panel, no interruption, just 2 chairs, 2 microphones, and a conversation that no one planned, but everyone needed. Carla leaned in gently. "You've had a few days now to process everything. Why did Miss Porter's call hit so hard?" Jasmine didn't flinch. It didn't hit hard. She said it reminded me of what that I've spent years trying to prove I belong in rooms I already earned my way into. And it only takes one person with a microphone to make you feel like you're 7 again, waiting for someone to explain why the lights got shut off. Carla nodded, letting her speak. Miss Porter didn't say anything. I forgot she said everything I buried. Jasmine continued, and the thing is, I thought I left that girl behind, but she's still with me. She always will be. Carla gave a small pause, then asked carefully, were you surprised by the reaction? The public support Jasmine smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. I was surprised people still care about the truth across the country. Local newspapers were running editorials not just on Jasmine's response, but on the way teachers like Miss Porter are often forgotten until someone needs a headline. Parents were calling school boards asking how many kids in their district might be sleeping in cars or coming to class without breakfast, and politicians both sides of the aisle had taken notice. Some praised Jasmine's composure, a few offered weak statements about respecting educators, but none had expected that a single call-in from a retired teacher would land heavier than 10 years of press briefings in a high school auditorium in Sacramento. A group of ninth graders spent their Friday homeroom watching the clip of Miss Porter. Their teacher, Mr. Figueroa, stood at the back arms, crossed listening as one student whispered to another, why is this making me want to call my third-grade teacher in Birmingham? A fifth-grade teacher read Jasmine's post aloud to her class, stopping at the line, you saw me when the world didn't. She told her students there's power in being seen. Don't ever forget that online former students began tagging their teachers with simple messages. You were my Miss Porter. Thank you. Even more powerful were the ones that came from people who never had a Miss Porter at all. I wish someone had seen me. I wish someone stayed after class for me. I wish someone told me I was worth more than a grade. The story had struck a nerve, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't, because millions of people had once been Jasmine or had known someone who was, and they remembered what it felt like to be misjudged before they could speak for themselves back in the studio. Carla's voice softened. Do you want to say anything directly to Miss Porter now? Jasmine took a deep breath, then looked straight at the camera. I do, she paused. You were the first person who told me I was smart without needing me to prove it. You didn't care what the test scores said. You looked at a tired little girl with scuffed shoes and called her worthy. You changed my life, and I never forgot it. A short silence passed between them. Carla glanced down at her notes, then said, there's talk that Miss Porter may be honored at next year's National Teachers Hall of Recognition. Jasmine nodded. She deserves that, but honestly, she didn't need a plaque. She had us that same evening. The Morning Circle Network announced a special 1-hour follow-up episode dedicated to voices in education. They invited Jasmine and Miss Porter to return this time, not to respond to insult, but to share their story in full. Pam Bondi declined to appear. A few people noticed, even fewer were surprised, but the real moment hadn't happened yet. Not until Jasmine and Miss Porter stood face to face for the first time in over 30 years, the studio was different. This time, fewer lights, no crowd, no panel, just a simple set, 2 chairs and a vase of white lilies between them. Craig Harmon returned as host, but even he felt different. Less polished, more thoughtful. Like the moment had grown too large for routine, the network called the episode Full Circle. A story of second chances. Jasmine arrived first in a navy blazer, in jeans. No makeup artist, no handlers, just her. She kept checking the hallway for Miss Porter like a student waiting for her name to be called for an award. She wasn't sure she deserved. Then the door opened. Miss Eileen Porter walked in wearing a beige coat, her silver hair, pinned-back eyes bright but focused. She paused when she saw Jasmine, as if her mind had to catch up to what her heart already knew. They stood still for a moment, then Jasmine stepped forward. I don't even know where to start, she said, her voice catching slightly. You just did, Miss Porter replied and pulled her into a hug. It wasn't a TV hug. It was real, one of those tight, wordless embraces that erases time. Jasmine pulled back and wiped at her eyes. Laughing under her breath, I should have worn waterproof mascara, Miss Porter chuckled. I should have brought tissues. They sat. Craig didn't even bother with the usual openers. Everyone saw the viral clip, he said. But we wanted people to understand the full story. Miss Porter nodded. The thing is, it's not just Jasmine's story. It's every student who ever got labeled too early and every teacher who stayed late and gave more than they had. Jasmine added quietly, and every politician who forgets where they came from. That line wasn't for anyone but herself, but across the country, people heard it. Pam Bondi hadn't responded since her brief written statement. No apology, no second interview, just silence. In the days that followed, more footage surfaced past appearances where she'd used humor to diminish others. One clip from a 2019 panel showed her laughing at another congresswoman's speech impediment. It had been overlooked at the time. Now it resurfaced with fire. Public opinion shifted not all at once, but undeniably. A former speechwriter from Bondi's team published a blog post titled, "When Your Whole Brand is Being Mean." Eventually, it catches up. Educators across the U.S. flooded inboxes with petitions to increase funding, support counselors, and protect teachers from budget cuts. Jasmine used the moment to call for legislation protecting at-risk students from academic labeling tied to school transfers. But through it all, she never mentioned Bondi again. Not out of fear, out of focus in the studio. Craig asked gently, "Jasmine, when you heard Miss Porter's voice come through that phone line, what did you feel?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. "I felt like I was back in that classroom." She said, "The afternoon light hitting those scratched desks, the smell of old markers, and Miss Porter beside me saying, 'You got it, kid.'" Miss Porter looked over and smiled, mist in her eyes. "I didn't know what you'd become," she said. "I just knew you mattered." The camera didn't cut away, and people didn't look away. Laughing under her breath, "I should have worn waterproof mascara," Miss Porter chuckled. "I should have brought tissues." They sat. Craig didn't even bother with the usual openers. "Everyone saw the viral clip," he said. "But we wanted people to understand the full story." Miss Porter nodded. "The thing is, it's not just Jasmine's story. It's every student who ever got labeled too early and every teacher who stayed late and gave more than they had." Jasmine added quietly, and every politician who forgets where they came from. That line wasn't for anyone but herself, but across the country, people heard it. Pam Bondi hadn't responded since her brief written statement. No apology, no second interview, just silence. In the days that followed, more footage surfaced past appearances where she'd used humor to diminish others. One clip from a 2019 panel showed her laughing at another congresswoman's speech impediment. It had been overlooked at the time. Now it resurfaced with fire. Public opinion shifted not all at once, but undeniably. A former speechwriter from Bondi's team published a blog post titled, "When Your Whole Brand is Being Mean." Eventually, it catches up. Educators across the U.S. flooded inboxes with petitions to increase funding, support counselors, and protect teachers from budget cuts. Jasmine used the moment to call for legislation protecting at-risk students from academic labeling tied to school transfers. But through it all, she never mentioned Bondi again. Not out of fear, out of focus in the studio. Craig asked gently, "Jasmine, when you heard Miss Porter's voice come through that phone line, what did you feel?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. "I felt like I was back in that classroom." She said, "The afternoon light hitting those scratched desks, the smell of old markers, and Miss Porter beside me saying, 'You got it, kid.'" Miss Porter looked over and smiled, mist in her eyes. "I didn't know what you'd become," she said. "I just knew you mattered." The camera didn't cut away, and people didn't look away. "What would you say to other teachers who feel forgotten?" Miss Porter didn't hesitate. "You're not forgotten. You're the reason half this country stands upright." She took a breath. "And the ones who try to shame your students? They've forgotten what it means to build something that lasts." That moment more than any viral clip or trending hashtag stuck. Because it wasn't about a fight on a panel. It wasn't about cancel culture or viral payback. It was about truth, raw, lived in, and finally spoken by the people who lived it. And in living rooms across the country, people sat quietly, some wiping tears, others just thinking about that one teacher who stayed late, who said, "You're not behind. You're just climbing a harder hill." But before the credits rolled, Jasmine stood up, walked to the camera, and said something no one expected, but everyone needed to hear. Jasmine stepped into the frame as the closing credits prepared to roll, but the camera didn't cut away. She stood tall, hands clasped in front of her. The studio silent, except for the faint hum of equipment. "I wasn't supposed to say anything else," she began. "But I've been thinking about what this really is." She took a step closer to the lens. This story isn't about me. It's not about Miss Porter. It's about the millions of people watching who needed someone like her and didn't have one. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It held. I didn't come here to shame anyone. I came here to say that the way we talk about people matters. The way we treat childhood. The raw, fragile parts of it matters. She looked down for a second, gathering her next words. You don't get to mock someone's struggle and call it just politics. You don't get to measure a child by a single rumor or a missed assignment or a hard year, because some of us grew up in borrowed shoes and ate dinner from gas station counters, and we still made it. The camera held still. Some kids won't ever hear they're enough. Some will spend decades trying to outgrow the shame someone else handed them. And if you're in a position of power, if people listen when you speak, then you owe it to them to speak with care. She paused again. Miss Porter taught me a lot of things, but what stuck the most was this. Your worst day doesn't define you. What you do next does. Craig, standing just off screen, didn't say a word. No one did. Jasmine nodded gently to every teacher who's ever stayed past the bell. To every kid who was ever told they wouldn't make it. You matter, your story matters. And with that, she stepped out of frame. The screen faded to black. No music, no outro, just silence in the following weeks. Classrooms across the country replayed the segment. Superintendents started internal audits of transfer policies. 2 school districts in Oklahoma reinstated after-school tutoring programs. They'd cut years ago. A local bakery in Birmingham started offering free breakfast to kids before school hours in honor of Miss Porter. The sign read at a middle school in Tempe. A hallway bulletin board was covered in index cards with student messages. I'm not behind, I'm climbing, my teacher sees me. I'm the reason someone stayed late. And Miss Porter? She went back to her quiet life. She still bought groceries on Thursdays, still fed the neighborhood, Kat still walked with her neighbor in the mornings. The difference was the notes that showed up in her mailbox, handwritten, folded in half, signed with names she hadn't heard in years. One said, you didn't know it, but I was watching, you showed me how to care. Jasmine returned to Congress a few days later. She got stopped on the steps by a young intern who said, you made my sister cry. But in a good way, she teaches 3rd grade in Amarillo. Jasmine smiled. She cried because she's tired, she said. And no one ever tells her that what she does matters. The intern nodded. She needed to hear it. And maybe that was the point. It was never about winning an argument. It was about reminding people of what gets overlooked, forgotten, or worse, mocked for sport. A single comment meant to humiliate turned into something else entirely. A national reflection on dignity, memory, and who we choose to lift up when no one else is looking. If this story moved, you share it with someone who once believed in you. And if you're lucky enough to have a Mrs. Porter in your life, tell them thank you while you still can. And if you're a teacher, a tutor, a coach, or a counselor, just know someone out there still remembers what you did for them. Even if they've never said it out loud, subscribe for more real stories that remind us who we are and who we owe.